Prairie Lakes Church, welcome, and welcome to Iowa, the place where we enjoy a relatively low cost of living because we have to live through weekends like this one. Most of us dealt with snow this week. All of us are dealing with really cold temperatures. So you may have ventured out and you're at your campus, and we're glad that you did. A lot of us are joining online, and hey, a lot of us, Prairie Lakes Church Online is just how we do church. So we're really grateful that you're joining us this weekend. And if this is your first weekend with us, it's a great one, okay? It's a great one because we're starting something this weekend that we do just 2 times a year. We do it here in the winter/spring, more winter than spring this time. And then we do it again in the fall, but here's what we're doing this weekend. We're starting a series that's specifically designed to be experienced here on the weekend at your campus or online and in a small group. And again, some of our small groups meet in homes and some of them are meeting virtually, but at the weekend and in your small group. And so a lot of you have signed up to be in small groups here for the next 4 weeks. And maybe this is your first time doing it. And maybe you're kind of nervous because maybe you're worried that the people in your group are going to be weirdos, or maybe you are the weirdo, right? And so, hey, listen, all of us are weirdos. Okay, and so if you took that step and you're connecting relationally in a small group and it feels kind of weird, that's okay. That's okay. Good job taking that step. All right, and hey, still time to sign up if you want. Go on our website at your connection desk. We'd love to have you, okay? All right, so here's the series that we're going to start this weekend. It's a series on the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. And for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be walking through Ruth 1 chapter at a time. So if you can do math, you're going to deduce that Ruth is four chapters long. Chapter a weekend. So this weekend I want to do 2 things as we start diving into Ruth together. One, I want to catch you up on the story, and really what I want to do is catch you up on how Ruth fits into the story of the Bible, which is really the story of Israel. And if you see where Ruth fits into the overall story, you're going to feel the full weight of the story that Ruth tells. Ruth is actually one of the best stories in the Bible, I think. We really get to know the people in the story. It's written in such a way that you can really feel what the characters are feeling. It's really relevant. It's really human. We don't know who wrote the book of Ruth, but a lot of good scholars think that a woman wrote it. All right. So we'll take a look at the story first, number 1, and number 2, this weekend we'll dive into chapter 1 together. Okay, so pretty simple, but first the story. Let's get to the story first. Where does Ruth fit into the entire story of the Bible, which is really the story of Israel? So I drew something for you to kind of help you visualize it. This timeline here is actually around 2 millennia. 2,000 years span from the beginning to the end of that line there. And starting with Adam and Noah and ending with Jesus. So let me just kind of walk you through what you're seeing here. Before the nation of Israel is a nation, before it's a political entity, Israel is really just a family, a clan, and then really a group of tribes. And these tribes are known as the Hebrews. They begin with the patriarchs. That's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham who has Isaac, and Isaac who has Jacob. And God renames Jacob Israel. And all of Jacob's descendants are known as Israelites. Israel has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes or states, if you will, of the nation of Israel. And really, Israel becomes an actual nation when they start having kings. They have a leader and laws and boundaries and economy and all of that when they have their first king, Saul, and then their second greatest king, David. But that era lasts only a little while because they get conquered and then they get exiled and they scatter. And this starts the era of the prophets in which God speaks to the nation of Israel through these prophets as they're scattered all over the place, okay? But there's this time between the patriarchs, when they're not quite yet a nation, and the kings, where they start being a nation. There's this time in between those two which is the time of the judges. The time of the judges. And that's the time that Ruth lives. She lives in the era of the judges. In fact, take a look at the very first words that you're going to read when you start reading the book of Ruth. Chapter 1, verse 1 says this, in the days when the judges ruled. That's what the author wants you to know, first and foremost, in the days when the judges ruled. So this is when Ruth lives. This is the time when the judges ruled. Now, the book of the Bible, right before Ruth, is actually called Judges. And it documents what life as an Israelite was like during that time. And it's a horrible time to live during the time of the judges if you're an Israelite. If you ever watched a movie like Mad Max or The Book of Eli, or even The Matrix, movies that are kind of apocalyptic in their genre, movies where society's just been decimated by something and there's no real law or governance, and there's just a lot of violence and upheaval, danger around every corner kind of thing. That's actually what it's like to live during the time of the judges. Here's how actually the book of Judges describes it. It says, another nation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. So in the time of the judges, the people who were supposed to lead you and protect you weren't. They just kind of went off and they did whatever they wanted to do. They broke all of their commitments to God. And so God, after repeated warnings says, I'm going to give you over to your enemies. And so you just lived in constant fear. That was the norm for you. Fear was the norm in the time of the judges. I mean, I'd imagine it would be like if you lived in modern day Iraq. You know, like you don't know if there's going to be a suicide bombing or a drone strike. Just no sense of safety or security. You don't know if your leaders are for you or against you. But even during this era, God didn't give up on his people. So take a look at what it says in verse 16 here. It says, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders, yet they would not listen to their judges, but they prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So that's who these judges were. And that's what they did. That's how God used them. They were military leaders who rescued Israel from the hands of their enemies as Israel cried out to God. But right after they were rescued and right after the judge died, they'd go back to their old ways. And then they'd get conquered again, and then they'd cry out to God again, and then God would raise up another judge only to, repeat the cycle. So here's how Judges sums it up in literally the last verse in the book of Judges, right before we get to that first verse in Ruth. And this verse is Judges 21:25. It exists right before Ruth, but it exists right after one of the most horrific stories that you will read in the Bible or anywhere. Here's what Judges 21:25 says. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Everyone did as they saw fit. So it's a pretty unsettling time that Ruth lived in. And even more so if you weren't one of the strongest or wealthiest or part of a bigger clan or family. I mean, it was a really bad time to be vulnerable in any way. If you were poor or sick, if you were single, or if you were an orphan, or if you were elderly, if you were a woman or a foreigner. If you were any one of those, or God forbid, more than one of those, you automatically had a target on your back. It's not unlike a predator circling a herd, just trying to pick off the most vulnerable. That's what it was like. You just did everything to blend in, to not draw attention, care for yourself, protect yourself. Which really leads us now to Ruth chapter 1, okay? So that's how Ruth fits into the overall story of the Bible. So let's dive into chapter 1 now. Now, although the book bears Ruth's name, chapter 1 isn't about Ruth, really. She appears there. Chapter 1 is not about Ruth, though. Chapter 1 is about Naomi. So let's read together Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there it is, there was a famine in the land, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. So just kind of track this. We've got Elimelech and Naomi, husband and wife. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, which is a city, in Judah, which is a region. And they went to Moab and they lived there, okay? So right away, in one of the worst times to live already, there's now a famine. And we don't know how or why the famine existed. It could be just lack of rain. It could be war. It could be a lot of reasons. But probably there's just not enough rain to grow crops. And back then they didn't get stimulus checks, nor could they apply for WIC. There's no crop insurance. There's no importing. Hard for us in 2021 to really get our minds around this. But like back then, no rain meant people die. It's just kind of how it was. So this family of 4 made a really hard decision, but it was the only decision they probably had, to leave their home in this little town of Bethlehem in the territory of Judah and to head out to the neighboring region of Moab. And I want to show you what this is like, okay? So this is this is a picture of, here's the Mediterranean Sea. This is modern day Israel. Here's the Dead Sea, okay? Here is Bethlehem, where this family started. And what they did is they had to make a trek around the northern part of the Dead Sea all the way south, then across this river Arnon to this region of Moab. It's about 50 miles, 50-mile trek. If you're a family of 4 with all of your earthly possessions traveling on foot, maybe a few donkeys or whatever, it's going to take you 7 to 10 days is what the average time would be for that trip. Now Moab, you can kind of see it on the map, it was fed by a river. So it was a likely place to find food. They didn't depend on rain as much. However, Moab and Israel were not very friendly. This wasn't like going up to Canada, okay? While they could trace their heritage back to a common ancestor, Abraham was their common ancestor. Moab descends from Abraham through Lot. Israel descends from Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. If you know the story of Abraham and Lot, uncle and nephew, they had a little bit of a falling out. And so really what this would be like in our times, it would be like if someone from Iran fled to the United States. Because you'd be looking at them and going, why are you here? Why are you here? So, okay, just keep score at home with me. Horrible time to live in, period. Everyone just did as they saw fit. Famine that's going to starve you and your family to death. And 3 now, you become a refugee in a region that hates you simply because of your ethnicity. Verses 1 and 2. Verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So, okay, it doesn't seem like it could get worse, but then it does. Right after they settle in Moab, the head of the family, Elimelech, dies. But thankfully, Naomi has 2 sons to care for her, and they get married. But after 10 years, neither of her sons has any children, and then they both die. So now, 4 verses in to the story, we've got Naomi, 10 years from the last time she saw her homeland, widowed, and grieving the loss of her 2 adult sons. 3 women now, bound not by blood, but by loss. 2 had married foreigners. 1 was a foreigner herself. So, before we go any further into this story, I just want to pause and I want to be confronted by what the author of Ruth wants us to be confronted about. Because we have this tendency to just kind of skim over. Give me to the good part. Let's be confronted by this, okay? Here's the reality. Pain is life, and life is pain. And that's not a statement that's meant to depress you or discourage you. It's just the truth. It's reality. And life is more than just pain, but even though it's not ever less. You know, there's no such thing as a pain-free life. It doesn't exist. If you're not living with it currently, you're just simply on the front end of it, or you're in between. I mean, famine, refugee, widowed, 2 funerals for my adult children. Cancer, job loss, divorce. Accident, disability, complications from surgery. We used to be best friends, we used to be close, but now GameStop went way up and GameStop went way down. You know, I mean, like, pain is life and life is pain. And anybody who wants to say that the Bible is just a book of fairy tales has not read it. The Bible is a book about life. The Bible is a book about real life, real people. And in real life, there's pain. There's just no way around that. Now, kind of a bummer of a way to start a Bible story. Right? Some of us remember growing up in Sunday school. We don't remember that. It's not how it's supposed to work with God. That's what we a lot of times, this isn't how it's supposed to work. And speaking of God, where is he at in all of this? Well, let's keep reading here. Ruth 1, 6 through 7. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living for the last 10 years and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. All right. So there's our first God sighting. There he is. He was providing food, not in Moab, but back in Israel for his people. And we're not really sure how or really what that means, how God did that, but word had reached Naomi that things back home were getting better. God had intervened in his people once again. Now, we just read verses 6 and 7 there. The space between those 2 verses is a decision. In verse 6, Naomi gets this news that God's up to something. And then in verse 7, Naomi starts walking towards him, but the space between verse 6 and verse 7 is the space of a decision. And I cannot imagine that it was an easy one for her. Because this so-called, God had allowed a lot of bad things to happen to Naomi. Famine that forced her family to move away from their home to being a refugee in a foreign country just to keep her kids alive. And then her husband died. And then her kids died. And in the next few verses, we're going to see a conversation she has with her widowed daughters-in-law, in which she confesses what is just the truth. She's way too old to start over. I mean, that's her window, and it's been closed. And now this God, intervenes, but not in her life. Not in her life. And not even where she is. And not when it mattered the most. No. He intervenes back at the place that she was forced to leave, The same place that God just let go to waste 10 years ago. I mean, we're only 7 verses in, but we've covered over a decade of tragedy in Naomi's life. Now, she does decide to go back, but more out of necessity than faith. Or at the very least, you have to say Naomi's conflicted, really conflicted. Take a look at verse 8, okay? Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, hey, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. So Naomi proves herself to be this just incredible woman full of grace and character and strength here. She's not going to demand that these 2 young women stay with her and take care of her. And she even blesses them in God's name. In God's name. I mean, through it all, she has maintained some kind of faith, right? But lest we paint some superhuman picture of this woman, she also says this to her daughters-in-law, which is a lot more relatable to us, I think. When they tell her, no, Naomi, we are not going to leave you. We're going to stay with her. Here's what Naomi says in the next couple of verses. But Naomi said, no, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Of course not. Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. God's against me. That's what Naomi said. You don't want to come with me. You'd be way better off away from me. I mean, maybe God will bless you, but he's against me. And honestly, it's really hard to disagree with her. As you read the rest of chapter 1 this week, what you'll see is that Ruth, despite Naomi's push, Ruth decides she's going to stay. In fact, the word that chapter 1 uses is clings. Ruth decides she's going to stay. And Naomi and Ruth have a tearful goodbye with Orpah, who, heeds Naomi's warnings and stays in Moab. Now, Naomi and Ruth then start the 50-mile trek around the Dead Sea from Moab back to Bethlehem, where Naomi hadn't been for 10 years. And when Naomi arrives back home, she's almost unrecognizable. Not just because she's 10 years older, but because she's so sad and so discouraged. I mean, life really had taken a toll on her. And her old neighbors whisper, "Is that Naomi?" And when she overhears them, she says, "Don't call me by that name anymore." See, the name Naomi, it meant pleasant one, kind of joyful one. She's just a joy to be around, That's what her name meant. But Naomi says, "No, I don't want to be called that anymore. I want you to call me Mara." And Mara is a Hebrew word for bitter. Bitter. Naomi says that she left full, but she's returning empty. Because that was the truth. Now, can you believe that I've been talking and you've been listening for as long as we both have, and Naomi's story has not gotten any better? How am I going to spin this one before we're done this weekend? Because I'm kind of out of time. Well, here's what you don't know. Naomi was not the first foreigner in a foreign land who lost her husband and was childless. She wasn't the first. In fact, the story of literally her entire people, the story of the whole nation of Israel, began in exactly the same way. Abraham, the first patriarch and ancestral father of this nation of Israel, along with his wife, Sarah, were in exactly the same boat. Foreigners in a foreign land, a land where God called them to go, ironically, the same exact land that Naomi found herself centuries later. And God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they'd have a child, but they were barren and they got old and it did not happen. Foreigners in a foreign land, the same land that Naomi found herself, childless, just like Naomi found herself, and God forsaking them, apparently, just like Naomi found herself. Until God showed up. Until God intervened. Until God fulfilled his promise to Abraham and Sarah, even in their old age. Until they had a child. And that was centuries before. Centuries before. Naomi was not the first to find herself in that situation. And Naomi wouldn't be the last. Centuries later, in that same little town of Bethlehem, the same town that Naomi was crash landing into, Bethlehem of Ephrathah in the land of Judah. God would once again enter into a broken world, and he would break a 400-year silence to fulfill a promise that he made when brokenness first entered the entire world. Same town. See, Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth, she would marry a man in Bethlehem who would take care of both Ruth and Naomi. And Ruth would have a son. Naomi would have a grandson. They'd name him Obed. Obed would have a son. He'd name him Jesse. Jesse would have a son. He'd name him David. David would kill the giant Goliath. David would become the nation of Israel's greatest king. And from David, though the nation that he led would eventually fall and that pattern would repeat and Israel would be scattered, from David, centuries later, at a time when Caesar ruled the world, the Roman Empire, Caesar would make a decree that everybody had to return to their ancestral hometown in order to be counted. So a man named Joseph, who traced his lineage back to David, back to Ruth, back to Naomi, had to go back to this forgotten little town of Bethlehem with his pregnant wife. And there wasn't any room for them to stay anywhere, so he had to deliver their firstborn in the same place that baby calves were born. And his infant son spent his first night in a feeding trough. And it wasn't long after that that Joseph had to take his family and become a foreigner in foreign land because they were fleeing for their lives as well. But that baby's name, Naomi's descendant, was Jesus. And they'd also call him Emmanuel, meaning God with us. So I'm not trying to spin it, but I do need you to see this, okay? Life is pain, and pain is real. The real part of the story. But even our worst pain will bow to the life that God has planned. Pain does not have the final say over our lives. God does. Pain doesn't have the final say over your life. It's a real part of our lives, I know. It does not have the final say. So, maybe like Naomi, you've got this space of a decision, all right? It's a space of a decision. Maybe like Naomi, you feel like God is against you. And maybe it would be really hard to disagree with you. Maybe like Naomi, you're hearing rumors of this God moving, what this God can do, how he's intervening, but it seems to be somewhere else for someone else, and not at a time when it mattered to you the most. But I think the question, as you dive into Ruth 1, is this. In the space of that decision for you, where you are currently, which direction will your next step take you? Are you going to stay in your pain? Or are you going to take a step toward where God is working? Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this beautiful story of Ruth. God, thank you for how human it is and how relevant it is and how accessible and approachable it is. Specifically, God, for those of us who are in these seasons or dealing with seasons of just pain of any kind, would you whisper those rumors to our hearts of your plan and your work? And would you draw us closer to you? Jesus, we pray this in your name. Amen.